Welcome to the Midlife Men podcast with me, Philip Briscoe. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Brian Livesay, a trauma therapist and director of clinical research at Arise Alliance, whose personal experiences have shaped his groundbreaking approach to healing called critical memory integration, which we'll hear more about. So welcome, Brian.
Thank you. Welcome accepted. I appreciate the invitation and looking forward to our conversation today, Philip.
So Brian, can you start by sharing a bit about your own story, your own experiences?
Yeah. I think it's always a challenge to find where does the beginning of things really begin. For a lot of us, we have, a childhood. It informs so much about who we are and where we come from. But we carry those things into our adulthood too. I think my story really begins with early adulthood, and I'm kind of out on my own for the first time. I've got a university scholarship to play football, what we Yankees like to call football anyways. So I'm wearing a helmet and pads, and I'm smashing into people a lot bigger than I am, if you could believe it. And that was a kind of an early experience of what it's like to be to become this next phase of life, to become this man, to become this creature who has to navigate challenges and difficulties and to do things on his own. And here I am doing just that. And it's interesting because I'm not doing it alone. I'm doing it in a team, in a fraternity of sorts, around other players and comrades who are in a lot of ways mentors. They've been there longer and they know more about things. And so just this early experience of being brought into something bigger than myself, it's kind of a framework for so much of my experience thereafter. Is also a lot of fun, and they're paying for school, so why not? It's an interesting starting point because it was also a leaving of a different sort of fraternity of sorts, right? My family, I've got 5 younger brothers and as many sisters as well. But this is a unit that I left, and I joined another unit. The unit that I left obviously never left me. There's a part of that story that really, kind of interweaves and, intertwines with where I was going and how I was learning about myself. It was this relationship with my next youngest brother. So we're very close, the closest of the brothers. I went to play college football and he went to become a combat engineer. And at the time, we're talking like early, mid 2000s. And so he's deployed in the theater of war, and he's in a different unit, and he's in a unit where the stakes are very different. And so we kind of have these parallel paths, these parallel stories, and the way in which his experience, which was really early on, when he's over there and kind of going through it, very much out of my range of understanding and so much that I didn't know about. When he came back, our worlds kind of came back together, and there was a clash of sorts between these different places, but there's also so much that overlapped, things that I couldn't understand but could understand too. And for those things that I couldn't understand for my brother, it was a motivating force to know more, to understand how do I re-engage, how do I reconnect with him in particular, but also this sense of, my early tribe, right? My siblings. How do I reconnect with this part of me that, this part of my past, certainly my childhood, is so important to who I am. How do I reconnect with this? And it's like a great question, right? It was one that didn't have an obvious answer, certainly not an immediate one, but it was a motivating force to seek out, how do I reconnect? How do I find myself able to get back in touch with these relationships? And part of it was figuring out something about myself. Part of it was figuring out and learning more about who my brother had become, who I had become in that time. Part of it was, for my personal journey, was enlisting in the military myself to become a soldier and to experience certain things. It's interesting because, like I said, there was no obvious answer, no immediate answer, but it was a motivating force to understand something about this bigger thing than just me. And, along the journey, I just continued to run into these sort of like recapitulations. Like it's the experience all over again. Here's another relationship that I'm disconnected from. How do I connect with it? Here's an example of disconnection between relationships. How do I understand it? How do I help folks reconnect with these parts of themselves? And I'm doing all of this before I'm even in a clinical capacity. I'm wondering about this. This is my journey. This is what motivates me.
So you're talking about the relationship that you have with your brother and how that developed. I mean, what caused perhaps changes in that relationship, particularly with perhaps your brother and his own experiences?
It was not apparent to me in any sort of like immediate sense, something that upon reflection seems so much more obvious, as I've developed my understanding of the human nervous system and human dynamics and the way people operate and work. I suppose that's helpful. In the moment, it was, in those moments of trying to reconnect with my brother, it was recognizing that his connection with himself was attenuated. It's so interesting that when we need to connect with somebody, that their connection within themselves seems to also be an important component. I think we experience it a lot too, within our relationships, within with our children, with our spouses, wherever the case may be, that when we're not feeling connected within ourselves, when we don't have a sense of who we are in this moment, when things feel chaotic internally, that it's really hard for others to connect with us.
Was that as an experience, as a result of the experiences he had in a war scenario?
It was, and it's, there are no shortage of ways to encounter these sorts of traumatic experiences. Of course, being in theater during OEF and OIF, plenty of opportunity for this sort of thing. And to be also sort of removed as he was when he returned, and he eventually left the military, to be removed from your tribe, your people, is also this sort of disconnecting force. But to be in those experiences where, threat to life and traumatic loss, and to see the landscape of, what will be challenges to our sense of moral and what's right and what's good, all of that is a ground for, retreating within oneself, and to disconnect, and to lose that sort of connection, even within oneself. And I think that was his experience. And that was something I didn't recognize at first. I think for so many folks, they might hear something in what I'm saying and say, yeah, I've got a family member, I've got a loved one who does disconnect, and I can't connect with them. And I don't really understand why or how that works. But that was part of the journey for me, is like to discover like what's going on within ourselves, within our broken connection and our lack of connection and our loss of connection with others.
And you joined the military yourself, you said. Did that help you to reconnect or to understand perhaps what your brother had been through?
I think it did. I think it certainly did in our relationship. I think for so many other reasons and by so many other, wills of force and effort, the reconnection was happening. It was something I felt like I needed to do. There was a sort of a call within my own sense of self that, that was an appropriate path for my life. This side quest of, college football, whatever it was just something to do while I was waiting to start this other thing. And I did, and I joined, and it was a very rich experience for me. I think it opened up the sort of, the opportunity, sort of opened up this like landscape of opportunity, which would eventually become, so much that is my career now in the work that I do now, to see where the the things that I'm noticing on a very local level, like it's everywhere. It's all throughout the world. And, that means that the adventure, and sort of repairing and reconnecting with my brother as a sort of local adventure, it's like that just iterates. There's more and more and more. I think that's how adventures go. You don't stop, when, you finish the first sort of cycle of recovery, grabbing that thing of value and bringing it back into your life. That's just the setup for the next one and the bigger one. And so, I've really seen it that way. My military career has provided me a lot of opportunity and reason and motivation to engage with, especially men. Obviously, military tends to skew male. I think that's always been the case, and it certainly is in my experience. So I found myself, in the work that I do, I find myself working with men quite often. And there's these sort of consistent patterns that I see that are so well informed by my experience with my brother.
So this was really your route in then to the work that you do now, this personal experience. And why do you think then, particularly in this, talking about perhaps a military scenario with veterans, why do you think many men, keep their emotions hidden? They keep all of this inside.
It's a worthwhile question, Philip. Why do we do it this way? I think there's an equation that includes many factors. I said the multifactorial sort of reasons for this. And there's certainly parts of it that seem to be biological, the way our brain develops and our nervous system develops, but more than that, how that sort of positions us to be and interact in the social sphere, the social setting. And of course, over time, we import all of those sort of social technologies into the persisting society, right? And then that feeds back into us. So what am I getting at? Not much of an answer yet, but it's like all of these things, it's kind of where we start, but also what's in the world waiting for us, these messages. Environment has so much to do with how we respond, but also that sort of milieu, that pressure, that example that precedes us and permeates us of some emotions are good and useful. Let's amplify those. Other emotions are less useful. And in fact, they may even be wrong in some sense. And you get that sort of tacit message. It's wrong to feel that or to express that feeling. Look, I don't think I'm saying anything that's, new or profound. Folks know this, but the facts remain that human beings have, and this is a truth of men too, we have an emotional landscape within us. These emotions and these sensations and these feelings have a role and a purpose, like everything else, like the opposable thumb, like the heel that strikes the ground that helps us balance. So many things about us are necessary. Why wouldn't these be necessary too? So there is a recognition of that necessity, I think, that is lacking and is waiting, and certainly a part of my work.
So when you do have, let's call it unspoken trauma, yet to be resolved, emotions and trauma, how do you see that showing up, in everyday life?
Yeah. This is a sort of unescapable force of nature. It's been described in a lot of different ways. I think, early in the field of psychology, they used the metaphor of pressure. And pressures, I think, probably because the steam engine was in vogue then, right? Everything was sort of seen through that lens. Now we sort of use more computer-based analogies, but the fact remains is that there is a manifestation of these things in everyday life. They come through, they break through. And it's like, like any other sort of biological function, eventually you're going to have to address that need or, atrophy or suffer the consequence or, become less than what you could be, become less healthy. And so when these things show up as a sort of function of force or sort of, as a sort of necessity of the pressures that build up within us, oftentimes it's showing up in a way that's not helpful. I think that's what a lot of folks notice. It's like, yeah, I've got these emotions, but when they show up, it's like, it disrupts the conversation or completely turns it on its head. Or, I've got these emotions, I've got these feelings, I've got these internal experiences, and I don't trust them. And so I will imbue and recruit additional effort to hold those things back. But yet they're there. And so they do show up either in sort of like the internal way that only the individual kind of experiences as a sort of, contention within themselves, or they'll kick the door down, in the middle of, what would otherwise have been a perfectly fine conversation or argument where solutions were being arrived at, and completely disrupt everything. I mean, those are some examples. They will find their way through.
And is that because men, and I know we're talking a lot here about veterans and first responders and people that have perhaps experienced more trauma than usual. Is it because they're not supported or they're not taught how to manage those emotions?
Yeah, I think this is another one of those many factors contribute to. But I think that assessment right there in the question is that we're not taught, or we're not sort of offered a way to do it. I think that captures most of the issue, is that there's not a convention that's readily available for the exploration of these parts. I think most listeners here might recognize the term mindfulness when I bring it up. There's a reason why mindfulness has kind of like a wildfire moved through the zeitgeist over the last, 10 years, maybe 15 years, is because it brings with it something that's important. That's something that folks, when they experience, they recognize as very helpful, very useful. It fills a gap of sorts. And, intentionally or otherwise, it does seem to be filling in for something that folks are missing. As I look at it, that missingness needs to be approached very attentionally too. It's not just that you can, meditate and that be the answer for everything. There actually needs to be a concerted effort to identify what it is that is going on within me, within my experience, within my feeling set, within my emotion set, to be able to explore it in a safe way, in a place, and within a time frame that allows for real rich connection and understanding with those things, so that they can be organized, so that they can be put in their proper place, and so that they can inform folks and with what's going on around them and what's going on within them, rather than disrupting folks. And that's what it'll do. It'll disrupt if it's not well understood and well mapped out and well organized. So we need conventions. We need conventions to be reinstalled. We need the version of the tribe around the campfire after the hunt, where we're sitting around and we're talking, where it's safe to do so, where we're experiencing, where we're getting into the depths of the subconscious in a very felt and experienced and conscious way. And to do so provides an organizing opportunity. We need to find those things.
Is this, so you developed a new approach called critical memory integration. Is this what you're talking about now then, this way of managing?
Yeah, I appreciate, Philip, you bringing that up. It is in a way just that, where critical memory integration. So this is a sort of a career-long so far effort to bring in the things that we know, to look at the experiences we have as a development team. I'm part of the development team for this, to say, hey, these are the things that we're noticing in our interactions with our clients and within our lives and our families. How do we extract the truths out of all of this? And so the CMI project has been an effort to do that and to provide an opportunity, and it's in an individual basis. If I'm working with someone in therapy, it's me and it's another person. Most times it's another veteran. And so this is a place where, for the first time, for many of these folks, they're able to explore something that's been going on as sensations and emotions and feelings and all those sort of textures and components of experience that aren't just the verbal sort of talk components. The way that talk therapy will sort of extract a conversation. There are components of a memory and experience that are different than just what we can describe and what we can talk about. to be able to, create an opportunity in a sort of healthy and therapeutic setting that we do as therapists. I'm a therapist, and this is what I offer for my clients. It's been able to put them into a mode of connecting to something that was always there and always needed to be connected to. And when they can do that, they discover like, hey, there's so much more to me and about me that I didn't realize. And if all of that is true about my capacities to experience these things without being completely undone by them, to be able to put them sort of in context and to let them inform me and who I am and what I need to do next, I can go out and I can share this with others. I can bring this into my relationships. I can iterate on this thing in a way that allows me to remain and stay and continue this healthy trajectory. And so that's, CMI, without getting into too much detail, that's what we're trying to get at. We're trying to create new conventions.
So you said it's different from, traditional talk therapy. Can you kind of give an example of how it's different then? How somebody who's, processing trauma, perhaps, it's a first responder who's had, exposed to a lot of trauma in their life, and, just talking about it isn't going to do it. So can you give an example of what you mean by, a different way of managing those emotions and how to process them to move forward?
Absolutely. Yeah, Philip, I appreciate the question. I think that it is useful to have a understanding of what, talk therapy and what therapeutic, what potential is in the therapy process. I think for folks to understand that, what talk therapy does well, it does very well, but it is also just doing a specific thing. If I was trying to work on an analogy before our meeting, but if we think about our past experiences, and we'll call them, I like to call them critical experiences, and most folks sort of recognize what I mean by that when I say it. These critical experiences, they hang around and they become critical memories, and these critical memories stay with us, indefinitely if we don't integrate them. When these critical memories sort of show up, it feels very much like that memory is happening to us. The feelings, the sensations, the emotions, the thoughts, everything that is sort of comprised of that critical memory, it's happening to us. It's happening to a person. That's often how folks feel it. Like it is taking over. Okay. So if this critical memory is there and it often takes over, how can talk therapy help somebody with that? Well, what talk therapy likes to do, and a lot of cognitive therapies, is it likes to build another mechanism somewhere else in the nervous system that when that critical memory wants to take over, this other mechanism can fire up and engage simultaneously. And over time, that critical memory would just begin to become quieter and quieter and eventually sort of extinguish, like go away. It's a intense effort and it's a consistent effort. It's like learning a new language. You constantly have to remind yourself, no, it's this word. It's this thing. I'm not saying it that way. I'm saying it this way. I've never learned a new language. I took Latin for a couple semesters, but that was a mistake. But I hope the analogy lands for some folks. So, you've got to work very hard at this. You get this mechanism built somewhere else in the nervous system. It's got to compete with the critical memory. And a lot of talk therapy kind of fits into that, especially the cognitive therapies. Other interventions will do things, some, like pharmaceutical interventions. Some other interventions will do something like try to quiet the critical memory, try to make the critical memory less impactful when it shows up. And then there's CMI, and a lot of experiential therapies do what CMI does. And it's different because when the critical memory is happening to the person, we want to reverse the roles, reverse the dynamic, I should say. So for the client, for the veteran I'm working with, for them to be able to engage with the critical memory, instead of the critical memory happening to them, they're happening to it. So they're moving toward it. They're experiencing it in real time in a rich and deep and thorough way. But they're doing that with their own sense of stability and safety and connection and their own sense of agency. their ability to stay connected and agentic as they experience the critical memory. Now, this fundamentally changes what that critical memory is and how it shows up. By doing these things, we can reformat. And so now I'm going to go from the steam engine analogy to the computer analogy. It's like reformatting the Word document. You're putting in new information when you do it this way. You're not just writing a new Word document that you're pulling up quickly. You're rewriting the very text, the very code, the very neurons in the network that make up this critical memory are changing. And it does so through this idea of memory reconsolidation. So what CMI is doing is different from talk therapy in that we're changing the very nature, we're modifying the very nature of their critical memory, where it is. We're changing how it relates to everything else in the nervous system. So that's kind of the big idea with critical memory integration.
So you're not talking about hypnotherapy here. I mean, how do you, presumably it's very painful for people to go back to particularly traumatic experiences that may be causing these memories. I mean, presumably you are on hand to help with that because, you're trying to re-engineer the way that it's then, set in the memory, but presumably that can be very difficult for some people.
Yeah. I think your intuition on that is right on, which is this is a ostensibly difficult thing to approach. Like how would one head right into the fray? That's the difficult thing. We've been trying everything we can our whole lives to not experience that. And you're saying experience that? Yes, I am. I am saying that experiencing that is the right track, is the right path. And in a lot of ways, I'm going to appeal to things like the hero's journey here. In a lot of ways, there's a tradition of what the hero is supposed to be doing. And it's sort of codified in these stories. You're actually supposed to head into the difficult thing. And then as you do so, you learn something about yourself. I mean, that's always how the story goes, is you pick up some tools, you face some adversity, and there's growth. This happens in these therapy sessions within the course of 20, 30, 40 minutes, is that they learn something about themselves. It's, I've got these pictures, like murals up here of St. George. St. George isn't going out to fight the dragon, in nothing but his nightshirt. He's armed, he's armored, and he's on his horse. And there's a process in these, therapy settings of like armoring yourself, mounting your steed. And to do so fundamentally changes the relationship with that difficult thing from the past. And it's a sort of discovery of folks to say, if I head into that which is difficult, if I steer into the waves, it doesn't capsize me. I just ride it out, up and down. And I learn something about what I can do. Folks learn very quickly as they're going through this. That was more difficult than as difficult as I thought that would be. It wasn't so difficult that I couldn't endure it. Maybe I can take on more. And they do. And they take on bit by bit. They take on bigger and bigger things until they find themselves surrounded in this critical memory, fully connected, fully competent, fully agentic, fully capable of making the connections and the integration that they need to make. And they come out and they'll, what was that? What did you do? I didn't do anything. You did it. You're the hero. I'm just here supporting you. I'm here holding the space. I think that's important to have somebody to hold the space. But what's important, I hope listeners get this message. What's most important is that the folks I work with, they're the heroes. They're the experts. They're the ones doing this, and they can every single time they can.
And from a practical perspective, then, just trying to think of an example. If you've been in if you're a veteran, you've been in a war scenario, perhaps you've seen loss of life, and you're being taken back to that scenario, and you are saying, well, you're now the hero, you're going in there with a different, I mean, is it altering the mindset? I mean, how do you take away essentially what they witnessed as something extremely traumatic and probably unpleasant? So you're saying by them going in and recasting themselves, if you like, as it not happening to them, but they're the hero, that is changing the way that they manage that memory and experience going forward.
It is I like the word recasting. In a sense, it's that the experience doesn't change. I change in relationship to it. Like, you know, St. George in his nightshirt, like the dragon's still a dragon, and he's a lot more vulnerable to it. It's chasing him around. But if he recasts himself as the hero in this episode, well, the dragon itself hasn't changed, but his relationship to it has. And so for the veteran who's experienced these horrific things, how those memories are happening to the veteran, it's a particular dynamic. There's a particular relationship there. And they're doing their best to sort of constrict that experience, that memory as it shows up from one day to the next in their sleep, right? In their, mundane sort of activities of the day, on the TV show. It shows up, it jumps through, it attacks. Now, if I change my role, if I head toward this thing, is it any different? Well, in a sense, it's like a yes and no. It changes as I recast myself because the relationship that I have with it changes. I know I'm speaking a lot of metaphor, and there's more sort of technical sort of examples or descriptions of this process. But if I could put it as, as technically while also simply as possible, it's something like this. If I had a critical event happen, a traumatic event, where was my nervous system during that time? Was I in a state of fight or flight? Was I disconnected from my sense of agency and being able to do what was best for me, et cetera, et cetera? Or were the circumstances and the environment happening to me? Were things beyond my control? That's oftentimes how folks experience it. And they have to organize that experience of things being beyond the control of the moment. To go back to a critical event as it becomes a critical memory over time, to go back to that critical memory with a sense of calm, safe, connected. That's very different than that fight or flight state. Topographically, you look at the nervous system, very different states. So I'm on my steed now, right? That's me. That's St. George on his horse. I'm in a different place. As I move toward the critical memory, that's my armor. That's my agency. As I continue to progress through the more and more difficult thing, that's my arms. That's my lance. That's my spear. That's the exacting force of these integration components, where the current state of the individual approaching the critical memory, that's what creates the integration process. It changes its relationship by being able to move toward it in a different state, in a connected state, feeling all of the difficulty, feeling all of the pain, feeling all of the suffering, while also being calm, safe, connected, agentic, competent. That's a very different thing than when it was first installed.
So how the people that you work with, largely men that you work with, how much does, kind of community play in this kind of healing process? Because I'm assuming a lot of people have experienced very similar traumas. So they work with you, one-on-one, but then how does a broader community help with a kind of ongoing recovery?
And the biggest thing I see, there's a lot of opportunity for community among veterans. And we have a lot of veterans in the States. We've got a lot of Vietnam veterans where I am and where I work, but a lot of the younger guys too. I call them younger guys, but really they're, I suppose, my age, maybe a little bit younger. The OEF guys. And the opportunities for community, there's a lot of different ways that community can happen and show up, all of which are good. In the context of the healing process, though, the way that particular community can iterate is so important. And, just as a parenthetical here, Philip, a lot of that community was lost as the sort of military structure advanced into modernity. World War II, they had opportunity for this community as they're sailing back on ships, coming back to the States, right? Weeks and weeks of time spent in close quarters where they can engage and connect and talk about stuff. Very different now. The community is less a force and function of the structure of the military in the way that's healthy and healing for our veterans. And so when I see community showing back up in this sort of healthy and healing way, I see that as like the, filling in the gaps, the parts of the community that's not there. It's for the folks who've experienced their own sort of hero's journey, so to speak, to reach out to the next veteran, to fulfill the role of mentor and say, hey, you got this, but you do need some things. Take this and go forward. Answer the call. And that sort of community, as I've seen it, it's such an important and necessary thing. And then finding that community is not easy. Sometimes it finds you. And I see that a lot too. Veterans who are like, they're looking for their brothers and sisters who are hurting, and they're going to go find them. And they're going to bring them in. But not everybody has that opportunity. And so, I encourage folks to look for it, to seek it, find that healing community.
So you're obviously you're a therapist, and you work with people one-on-one. But for somebody listening to this today who feels, what we're talking about resonates with them, and they feel really stuck or disconnected, what's one small first step that somebody can take today just to start to become a bit more unstuck?
Yeah, I really appreciate this question, Philip. It must always be a sense of hope for folks, and it's not manufactured. Like, I want folks to know that there is always a first step. There's always something right now. The little things that we can do often are just the things we can do on our own within ourselves, until we find that, that individual who fills the role of the mentor, that community who creates this sort of safety and sense of safety, that campfire where we can sit around and open up. Until we get there, we're on our own, and we're listening, and we need to listen. There are signals that come through from our inner world, from our subconscious, from our unconscious parts, the nervous system that communicates constantly. Listen to those signals. What are they saying? What are they telling? Oftentimes they'll indicate to us, hey, there's something here that's not in its place. There's something here that's not working for me. And so to listen to those signals when it's quiet and when it's not loud, to become curious about where that's showing up and how that's showing up. That's something folks can do right now. What is that thing that happened during the argument, during the encounter, last week, yesterday, whatever it is? What was that thing that was showing up that I immediately, obfuscated with anger? Explore that. Be curious about that. To have that mind of approach and curiosity is a good first start. And I want to offer one more thing, Philip, is that sometimes it really begins with just finding a way to get reconnected with our state of calm and safe, right? We feel that sort of elevation of the, autonomic nervous system, the fight or flight, reflexes kicking in. Take that deep breath and blow it out. Literally. Creating an opportunity for your conscious mind to move back into control of the autonomic nervous system. Notice that sensation of calming as you take that deep breath. I mean, these are small things that we can do, but they're very meaningful. They're very necessary. They're very important, and they're really useful first steps. Things that I teach folks on day one when I first meet them.
That's great. Let me ask you one last question then, on a bit more of a macro level then. When you work in mental health with men, what do you think is the biggest challenge right now, for not just for men, for everyone, in terms of, mental health and the challenges we all face, on a macro level? What can we be doing better?
There's a few ways I could go with this, Philip. I think.
Good question. Sorry.
No, I love it though, and I'll try not to go in all 9 directions at once. I think something that I have been feeling more and more in a weighted and heavy way is the ways in which I'm going to use a term here. I'm not sure if it's the right one, like a pseudo reality of community and connection. It's sort of always available to us, and then it can kind of fill in a need for nutrition, like junk food might. But it's not quite right. It's not quite what we need. And of course, I'm talking about like the social medias and the kind of parasocial relationships. And there's utility in that, but it isn't it. We still need our face-to-face. We still need the sort of kind of the vibrations of another nervous system in the room with us that is curious and interested in exploring something difficult together. We still need community in the sort of flesh and blood form. And, as I see, progress and modernity, accelerating in so many ways, I see that there's this potential trap that many are even sort of experiencing in different ways already with, large language models and AI and, social media. It's a way of sort of satisfying a human need and desire and drive without getting everything that's really actually needed, without getting the real nourishment of a conversation, of a voice, of a mind and a nervous system next to me who is as curious and interested in the experiences that are happening between us as happening within us. That needs to be sort of prioritized. In a way, it's like an appeal to a traditional sort of form of community, which is odd to say because, that should be conventional still. But, it's something I see that must be emphasized. Let's not lose the handshake, the embrace, the voice, the subtle, sort of articulatable sort of nuances of communication between people. Those are necessary.
That's really important. Thank you. Thank you, Brian. Thank you for talking to us today. It's been really fascinating and learning about your approach and understanding more about how men can get through trauma and out the other side. So thanks, Brian. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Midlife Men podcast with me, Philip Briscoe. If you want to find out more about Brian and his work with critical memory integration, visit the Arise Alliance website, and we'll also put the link in the show notes. To help raise the profile of the podcast, it really helps if you can review the show and also share it with your own networks. And if you've got a story you'd like to share, then do contact me through the website mid-lifemen.com.